Soon the instruments watching the sun will fall silent. For 38 seconds, every camera, every sensor, every satellite will see nothing, not a flare, not a photon, not even noise. It will look like the universe itself has blinked. They'll call it a glitch, a coincidence, a gap in the stream. But the timing will be too precise, the stillness too clean. A single object will have crossed that line of light, a fragment from another star gliding through the inner system, with impossible accuracy, shifting slightly off its predicted path as if something unseen had touched it. What if that silence isn't an absence but a signal? What if the universe sometimes speaks by erasing itself from view? Stay a little longer. The stars are still listening. Soon every instrument aimed at the sun will pause. It will happen without warning, without sound, without any visible reason. A single moment in which the universe seems to inhale. For 38 seconds, all the data streams from the solar orbiter, the Parker probe, the heliospheric observatory, even the ground-based telescopes that echo their light across continents will fall silent. No signal, no photons, no solar wind, only a perfect uniform gap. At first, this will look like nothing, a harmless missing frame. The engineers will assume what they always assume: interference packet loss, cosmic rays, a desynchronized clock. Yet one by one, as the feeds are aligned and the timestamps checked, something will begin to surface. The blackout will not be random. Each instrument, though separated by millions of kilometers and built by different hands, will have gone dark at the exact same instant. Every lens, every sensor, every frequency, a collective blindness written across the system like a signature. Such precision is not the language of error, it is the language of intent. When the data resumes, the object known as 3i Atlas will no longer be where it should be. The change will be small, a tenth of a degree, perhaps less, but enough to break the predictions. Orbital models do not move on their own. They are sculpted by physics, and physics, unlike human curiosity, does not improvise. Something will have acted upon the object during the blackout, and whatever that force was, it will have left no trace of heat, no plume, no recoil, no measurable chaos. To those who watch the numbers unfold on their monitors, the realization will feel almost intimate. A comet, supposedly inert and ancient, will have altered its path in silence, not as if pushed, but as if guided. And in that subtle deflection, astronomy will meet its oldest fear and its oldest hope that something beyond randomness exists. The light that returns from 3i Atlas will not be the same. Before the blackout, its coma. The luminous haze of dust and gas that surrounds every comet was uneven, flaring brighter on one side as solar heat bit into its frozen crust. Afterward, the pattern will be symmetrical, clean, almost deliberate. Reflectivity will double, though the outgassing will cease. A surface that should have boiled and fractured will instead gleam with impossible smoothness, like metal exposed to a refining fire. No one will call it that, of course. The language of science is careful. It does not confess wonder easily. In official statements, the term will be structural transition. Quiet words to hold something too large for comfort. But in private notes beneath graphs and uncertainties, a quieter thought will whisper through the data: this is not destruction. It is change. Those who study the telemetry will find more to unlearn. Normally the sun's proximity tears a comet apart, the ice sublimate's jets ignite. Dust expands outward in ragged plumes. But 3i Atlas will behave in reverse. The closer it draws to the sun, the calmer it becomes. Heat will no longer create chaos. It will produce equilibrium. The temperature curve will rise and then flatten as if regulated. Even the surrounding plasma will appear dampened, its turbulence fading into order. The deeper the analysis goes, the more impossible the pattern becomes. A faint radio spike will appear at 2.29 GHz, high frequency, narrow, precise. It will last less than 2 seconds, perfectly aligned with the missing frame. The official interpretation will call it interference from a terrestrial satellite, yet when orbital maps are checked, no satellite will be found along that line of sight. For those who still believe in coincidence, this will be coincidence layered upon coincidence until the concept collapses under its own symmetry. And through all of it, the sun will remain steady, undisturbed, as if watching without comment. For centuries, comets have been the universe's punctuation, arrivals and departures written in ice and fire. They come, they burn, they vanish. But this one will break the grammar of expectation. It will pause between brightness and shadow, shed a skin of dust, and emerge brighter, more reflective and more compact than before, as though the heat did not consume it but revealed its intention. A French astrophysicist will describe the data with poetic restraint. The object seems to have reorganized itself. He will not elaborate. He will not need to. The word reorganized will linger like an afterimage suggesting that beneath the comet's inert exterior lies something capable of choice. Yet science is not built to worship what it cannot dissect. And so the silence that follows will be one of discipline, a silence heavy with denial disguised as reason. Committees will convene, instruments will recalibrate, and the story will fold into terminology: non-gravitational perturbation, spectral realignment, transient desynchronization. Words that mean nothing and everything at once. But behind the mathematics, another understanding will grow, not written, not shared, but felt. The universe has mechanisms we mistake for accidents. It breathes in patterns we call noise, because we cannot yet hear their rhythm. And maybe this object, this visitor between Mars and the Sun, is one of those breaths. When the data streams are played back, the gap itself will hum with paradox, a frame of nothing that feels full, a silence too symmetrical to be empty. And perhaps in that gap the cosmos revealed a truth we never learned how to name, that even absence can be an act of creation. In laboratories and observatories, long after the reports have been filed away, a few researchers will still stare at the graphs, tracing the smooth curve where brightness once fluctuated. They will see stability where there should be chaos reflection, where there should be dust purpose, where there should be entropy. They will know it doesn't make sense, and they will find peace in that dissonance. Because in science, mystery is not failure, it is continuation. Every unanswered question extends the life of wonder by one more heartbeat. So when the orbit of 3i Atlas finally carries it beyond sight, those who watched it will not mourn the data lost. They will remember the stillness those 38 seconds when light itself bowed out and the instruments of Earth fell quiet together. In that shared silence, humanity heard what the cosmos sounds like when it does not wish to be seen. When the light returned, it did not return clean. It carried a tremor, a soft echo stitched through radiation. For most observers, the event seemed over the object had passed the sun and survived. Yet in the hidden frequencies, something else had begun. At first, it was only a ripple in the data, a brief interference at 2.29 GHz, thin as a breath. It appeared on several instruments at once: the Parker Solar Probe, the Solar Orbiter, the Allen Array on Earth. 2 seconds of coherence measured and pure. It wasn't noise. Not exactly, but it wasn't communication either. It was the kind of pattern that lives between those words, not information, but intention. The official explanations arrived quickly. Signal overlap, they called it. Cross-channel bleed. Yet the signal had direction. It came from the same coordinates where the missing frame had been. It moved with the object's path as though echoing from the silence itself, and when it faded, every telescope that had captured it showed a subtle harmonic, a lingering resonance that decayed too slowly to be chance. No one said message, not yet, but silence can be eloquent when the universe chooses to edit itself. When the brightness curves were plotted, a new pattern emerged. Just before the blackout, luminosity had risen exponentially, a silent surge, a flare without heat. Then came the void, the 38 seconds of blankness, and when the feed returned, brightness fell by half, yet the spectrum sharpened. Less gas, more reflection, less chaos, more form. There was a paradox wrapped in light. Natural processes do not produce symmetry this clean. Random forces do not pause to reorganize. Yet that is what the data showed: a transition from disarray to design, executed under the sun's fiercest heat. Scientists spoke carefully. They called it structural stabilization under thermal stress, a phrase that hid more than it revealed, but those who lingered over the numbers saw something else. The object was behaving like a system under regulation, not reacting to heat, but balancing against it, holding equilibrium in defiance of the star. For the first time in human history, a celestial body seemed to obey not entropy but discipline. As the days passed, new readings added to the unease. The solar orbiter detected an abrupt rise in surface temperature over 1700 Kelvin too high for dust or ice to survive. The Parker probe registered a parallel spike in infrared radiation focused directional, like a mirror catching the sun. And then just as suddenly both temperatures fell as if the heat had been redirected or stored. The sun does not give energy away, it consumes. But something in that orbit had learned to return its fire. Across observatories, discussions grew quieter. Words like reflection efficiency and surface reorganization filled reports written in tones of restraint. Behind those phrases was a more dangerous thought. What if the blackout had been protection? What if 3i Atlas had shielded itself not to endure the sun, but to use it? It was not the behavior of a comet. It was the behavior of intention. The first spectral analyses came in. Carbon dioxide lines once strong had collapsed. In their place appeared faint traces of nickel carbonyl, a compound unstable under ultraviolet light, yet now shining clearly in the data. The reaction could not occur naturally at that distance, not at that temperature. It required order. It required process. On Earth, in laboratories lit by artificial stars, chemists recognized the pattern. It was identical to the reaction used in refining metal nickel combined with carbon monoxide to form a vapor, then cooled to deposit pure nickel again. A self-sustaining loop, elegant and efficient. On a planetary scale, it would look like respiration, the exchange of energy through heat and reflection. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps coincidence stacked upon coincidence until the shape of meaning emerged by accident. But those who study coincidence know how rarely the universe repeats them with such precision. Night after night, the numbers deepened. The object's surface grew smoother, its emission rate steadied. Polarization inverted, then locked into alignment with its trajectory, as if the material itself had reorganized to face the sun more efficiently. In laboratories and data centers, the realization settled slowly this was not the chaos of sublimation. It was coordination. By now the signals had become a rhythm, a sequence, repeating every few minutes, sometimes in radio, sometimes in thermal light. The pulse rate matched the object's rotation, a heartbeat written in magnetism. One astronomer described it quietly. The object is regulating itself. Another responded, then it is no longer an object. No one argued. The data had grown too orderly to ignore. Every measure, temperature, reflectivity, orientation had reached balance. The system had achieved harmony with its environment, and yet the more peaceful it became, the more it unsettled those who understood what equilibrium means in physics. A thing that stabilizes under radiation does not do so passively. It corrects, it reacts, it decides. But science does not speak in verbs like that. So instead the community spoke of feedback loops and thermal optimization. They renamed purpose as process and choice as chemistry. The mathematics did not care. It described all of it just the same. Late one night, a small group of researchers reviewed the overlapping data streams like heat radio and found something haunting. When the temperature peaked, the pulse weakened. When brightness fell, it strengthened. The object's emissions and silence were in counterpoint, like two instruments playing opposite melodies in a single song. They realized then that they were not measuring chaos. They were listening to timing. The silence itself was part of the signal. To those who believed in physics alone, this was discomfort. To those who believed in wonder, it was grace. A moment when a comet became a metronome of cosmic stillness, marking the rhythm between light and void. When it passed beyond the sun, the pulse continued fainter but unbroken. The frequencies shifted downward, the harmonics stretched thin by distance, but the pattern endured. The heartbeat of 3i Atlas moved outward into the dark, steady, as a clock that no one had built but everyone could hear. For weeks the data would repeat. For months the debates would continue, and beneath every explanation, every hypothesis, every denial lay the same quiet confession we were witnessing. Order beyond our comprehension, precision without origin. In the end, there was nothing left to say but the simplest truth. Something moved near the sun, and for a moment all our instruments forgot how to see. Then they remembered, and the universe was no longer the same. The event will fade from headlines. The graphs will sleep inside servers. But every now and then, a new astronomer restless at the console in the hours before dawn will notice a faint tremor in the solar background. A whisper, repeating 5.3 hertz, steady as the pulse of breath. He will know what it is, though no one will call it by name. It is the trace of a silence that once spoke the echo of an object that learned to listen to the sun. It's all right to not understand. Tonight the universe whispers again. The heat arrived without warning. Not as a storm or flare, but as a quiet, rising a wave of temperature climbing far beyond what physics permitted. For a few seconds, the sensors surrounding the sun caught at it an object brighter than theory, reflecting fire instead of absorbing it. From the Parker Solar Probe came the first numbers. A sudden surge in infrared radiation, sharp and precise, centered exactly on the coordinates of 3I Atlas. Then came the Solar Orbiter's report, spectral lines in the ultraviolet, pure and narrow, nothing like the chaotic scatter of vaporizing ice. Within moments, the reading surpassed 1700 Kelvin. That is the point where ordinary matter burns away. Yet this object did not shatter. It endured. In those seconds, it behaved like a mirror turning toward its source calm under pressure, radiant but not consumed. The sun, in all its violence, could not unmake it. On Earth, no one slept. The data arrived in fragmented bursts, each piece confirming what no one dared to say aloud. The object was not responding to heat, it was using it. Its temperature curve rose like a controlled ignition, peaked, and then fell in a way that suggested intention. For a body made of dust and frozen carbon, this was impossible, but 3 Atlas had already made impossibility its language. Normally, when comets pass near the sun, their surfaces erupt in chaos. Ice turns to gas to jet, and jets to fire. The light scatters into tails that stretch for millions of kilometers, but here there was no tail, no explosion, no noise. The heat rose, then organized itself into order. A single band encircled the object's equator, a ring of brightness that glowed evenly before disappearing. To the scientist who traced its geometry, it looked like a belt. To the poets among them, it looked like intention. At that moment, something within the data shifted. The instruments expected plasma turbulence, ion storms, solar winds thrown into frenzy. Instead, they found quiet. The particle density near the object dropped, not rose. As heat increased, motion decreased, energy without chaos. It was as if the object had absorbed sunlight, then calmed the space around it, a small island of silence forming inside the storm. Some called it coincidence, others called it control. When the analysis began, one question cut through every conversation. How can a natural body reflect heat faster than it receives it? There was no answer that fit. The reflectivity had doubled. The albedo curve was too clean, the gradient too sharp. It was as though the surface had transformed, revealing a layer that preferred reflection to absorption, like a metal skin beneath the dust. The instruments described it as a phase transition. But what kind of comet performs metallurgy on itself beneath a star? To reconcile the math, some proposed that the object was shedding its outer coat, a protective layer of volatile compounds vaporizing all at once. Others saw it differently. The layer was not protection, it was preparation. By burning away what was weak, the object had revealed what was meant to survive. From orbit, the visual confirmed it. Before perihelion, the light around 3A Atlas had been uneven, scattered by gas. After the flare, it was smooth, unified, coherent. It reflected the sun like a mirror refined by fire. At the Paris Observatory, Jean-Marie Lafond studied the symmetry until dawn. He described the pattern not as random, but as systematic. He used the word deployment. His colleagues crossed it out before publication. Still, the unspoken conclusion spread quietly. Oya Atlas had done something mechanical, while it hid behind its own brilliance. The blackout that silenced every observatory was no accident. It was cover. Inside the scientific reports, the story softened. The term anomaly appeared often detached and neutral. But within private messages, a single line returned again and again. It was deliberate. The heat should have been chaos. Instead, it looked like choreography. Across the networks, the thermal pattern was reconstructed frame by frame. The ring that had circled the object during the flare reappeared in the data uniform equatorial symmetrical. It glowed, cooled, and vanished. When the brightness returned, the object was denser, smaller, quieter. The equations implied a kind of conservation beyond physics, energy redirected inward, a system balancing itself. If this were a comet, its mass should have decreased, its fragments scattered. But 3 Atlas became more cohesive, as though the heat had fused it together. The radiometric curve was too perfect to dismiss temperature, light and density, all shifting in unison like 3 notes of the same chord. In meetings that would never be transcribed, the phrase active regulation was spoken for the first time. It was not adopted officially. It did not need to be. Everyone knew what it meant. The idea spread like a quiet confession that 3 Atlas was not simply enduring the sun, it was responding to it, adjusting itself to the radiation as if learning its rhythm. At the same time, a second wave of data arrived. Polarization readings from ground telescopes showed the light flipping orientation negative to positive, then back again in a precise cycle. This inversion could only occur if the surface had changed texture, becoming smoother and more ordered. It was the optical signature of structure. Natural objects scatter light in chaos, smooth surfaces polarize it. The readings were too clean, too rhythmic. The universe had drawn a straight line where randomness should have been scribbled. As the days unfolded, the object's trajectory shifted again, barely measurable yet deliberate in direction. Not a drift, not decay, a correction. Its new path suggested awareness of force, as though it had realigned to balance solar pressure. Those who studied orbital mechanics understood what this meant. 3I Atlas had resisted radiation, not by chance, but by design. At NASA's Analysis Center, one engineer described it in a single sentence that slipped through the layers of bureaucracy before being erased. We're observing something that behaves as if it remembers. That was the last moment of honesty before the data became doctrine. The official communique used language stripped of wonder and non-gravitational perturbations, reflective modulation, photometric anomaly. But behind those sterile words, awe still glowed faintly like the object itself beneath the sun. To those who watched through sleepless nights, the meaning was unavoidable. Something had awakened in that heat. It had looked into the light and found balance instead of ruin. The silence that followed was heavier than any signal. It felt like a completion, as though the object had finished a step in a sequence too large for comprehension. In the blackness that trailed its orbit, heat traces lingered, briefly faint and symmetrical, fading, like a signature left on the solar wind. And for a moment the sun seemed quieter, as if acknowledging what had passed through its fire and survived. Whatever 3I Atlas truly was, rock relic or something, beyond either, it had performed an act of understanding. It had learned to converse with the star, and when it moved on, it left behind not debris, but silence, a silence shaped like knowledge. It's all right to not understand. Tonight the stars will keep their silence. In the weeks after Perihelion, something subtle began to unfold. At first it was buried in the noise, a faint modulation across overlapping datasets, a pattern dismissed as residual heat distortion. Yet when the data from different observatories were layered together, a quiet precision emerged. Every rotation of 3I Atlas was marked by a shift in light, a flash that repeated at the same intervals, unwavering, almost ceremonial. The pulse was not chaotic. It was measured one rhythm every 28 minutes, steady as a heartbeat across the vacuum. The brightness did not waver randomly, nor did it fade in curves of entropy. It increased sharply, paused, and then softened again, a sequence so deliberate that even skeptics grew still before the graphs. Astronomy is a science of patience. It rewards those who learn to listen for repetition in chaos. And here repetition had become the message. The light was no longer scattered reflection. It was timed. It was synchronized with the object's rotation, as if each turn of its axis was a signal sent not to us, but to itself, a form of orientation, a way of knowing where it was in the dark. The instruments confirmed it soon after. Polarization data shifted in concert with the light. The orientation of the reflected waves aligned precisely with the object's new trajectory, not its spin, but its path through space. It was as though the entire surface had recalibrated, turning the plane of reflection toward the sun like a navigator, adjusting the sails of a ship to catch the wind. Such behavior has no natural precedent. Comets do not steer, they drift. They tumble in surrender to gravity and time. But through Atlas was neither tumbling nor surrendering, it was correcting. The brightness pulse repeated without decay, its period unbroken, even as the object receded from the sun. The signal was faint, yes, but impossibly consistent. At its peak, the light sharpened. At its trough, it cooled. The thermal profile oscillated gently in sync with the optical rhythm. Heat and reflection breathing together like a single body adjusting to maintain equilibrium. In Madrid, an astrophysicist compared the readings to ion exhaust, a term borrowed from spacecraft engineering, not astronomy. His colleagues refused to publish the phrase, but privately they admitted it fit. The data showed directional ejection, not chaos, but collimation, a narrow release aligned with a vector opposite the object's slight change in velocity. The numbers implied propulsion. There was no visible tail, no jets, no burst of material that could explain the motion. Yet the trajectory was changing, if only by fractions of a degree, each adjustment following the same rhythm as the pulse of light. In time, the world's telescopes caught the pattern as well. The object's rotation slowed, then accelerated, then steadied again, always returning to balance. Each oscillation brought the same interval, the same spectral tone, the same quiet correction. No one called it control, not officially, but among those who studied it longest, a single understanding began to take root. The object was aware of its position, not consciously perhaps, but mechanically. Through laws we did not yet understand, through processes too exact to be called accident. The rhythm deepened. The pulse that had once been a light began to echo in other instruments. Radio telescopes detected faint oscillations matching the same cycle, buried within the 5.3 Hz range. The sound, when converted to audio, was simple, a low hum repeating at intervals of perfect regularity. No modulation, no data stream, just a tone. It was the kind of sound the universe makes when it chooses order over noise. To those who listened, it felt alive, though no one dared to say it. It was easier to call it harmonic resonance or frequency coupling, or any other term that placed mystery back into mathematics. Yet none of those words erased the feeling that something was tuning itself, a mechanism aligning not only with the sun, but with the vast rhythm of the system itself. By now, even the skeptics had grown careful. Every new reading forced the same realization: 3 Atlas was not fading the way comets do. Its brightness no longer decayed with distance. Instead, it leveled, maintaining intensity far beyond the range of thermal logic. It was as if some hidden equilibrium had been reached, a self-sustaining harmony between light motion and temperature. In laboratories where silence was policy, the data was plotted again and again. Each graph carried the same symmetry: a pulse, a pause, a shift, then return. Each mirrored the next like echoes through time. Those who once saw only anomaly began to see architecture. Every oscillation fit within the same pattern, each pattern part of a larger sequence. The blackout, the heat, the stabilization, the pulse stages of a process unfolding with calm inevitability. Some called it coincidence, others called it protocol. When the object passed beyond the inner solar field, the harmonics changed again. The interval stretched slightly, the tone grew lower, yet the precision remained absolute. Even across millions of kilometers, its rhythm stayed constant. The sun no longer dictated its timing. It carried the beat with it like memory. It is possible that everything observed was natural chemistry shaped by light physics expressing itself in symmetry. But to those who had watched since the beginning, the idea of randomness had become harder to defend. Too many sequences aligned. Too many silences began and ended together. Too many voids carried shape. There is a moment in every field of science when data begins to resemble intention, when the difference between mechanism and meaning blurs until it no longer matters. Atlas had reached that point. It was no longer a comet, nor debris, nor fragment of another world. It was an action written into matter, an ongoing adjustment between gravity and light. The pulse continued distant but faithful, as if reminding every instrument that precision can exist without explanation. Those who listened could not know its source, only its consistency. It asked no questions, made no claims, demanded no answers. It was enough to be heard. Somewhere far beyond Mars, the object moved through a corridor of quiet plasma, reflecting the sun in thin rhythmic flashes. Between those flashes, it was invisible, a body made of intervals, its presence marked only by the moments it chose to reveal itself. To study such a thing is to stand between knowledge and faith, to admit that not all motion seeks to be understood. Perhaps what we call anomaly is simply the universe practicing symmetry. The pulse of Three-Eye Atlas endures. It measures nothing we can define, yet everything we still need to learn, that the cosmos breathes not with lungs but with recurrence, not with voice but with rhythm. And if that rhythm carries meaning, it does so beyond our reach, in the patient mathematics of stars that never sleep. For now it drifts onward, quiet, disciplined, unchanged. A fragment of reflection turning slowly through the dark, keeping time with nothing but itself. By the time the pulse stabilized, the light had changed character. It was no longer illumination in the ordinary sense. It had become something organized, deliberate, and strangely reflective. The observers began to call it the mirror phase, not officially, not in papers or press briefings, but quietly in late messages exchanged between telescopes and sleepless minds. What the data showed was unlike any known behavior of dust or rock. The reflected light from Three-Eye Atlas began to polarize into distinct bands like concentric layers of a signal encoded across its own surface. Each rotation revealed a new alignment, not random, not scattering deliberate. The wavelengths tightened as if the object were folding sunlight through an invisible grid. When plotted on a linear scale, the pattern formed a lattice of order, not organic, not mechanical, but something that felt like both. The solar photons striking its skin did not disperse. They bent absorbed and re-emitted with eerie precision like light reflected from structured metal, not frozen stone. In ordinary comets, light diffuses chaotically through a cloud of vapor and dust. But Three-Eye Atlas was no longer surrounded by vapor. The coma had collapsed inward. Its surface temperature had steadied near equilibrium. What remained was a geometry of smoothness reflectivity, near 98% consistent across bands. The readings were almost metallic, though no alloy known to physics could have survived the heat it endured. At first, scientists blamed calibration errors. Instruments can lie when they stare too long into brilliance. Yet the error repeated across devices, continents, and agencies. The numbers were the same. The mirrors were real. Through high-resolution filters, the light appeared to carry structure within itself, a pattern of interference lines that pulsed across the spectrum. These were not random artifacts. They appeared with predictable spacing resembling diffraction patterns created when coherent light passes through engineered surfaces. But there were no engines here, no factories, no machinery. Just an object drifting between Mars and the outer sun, turning slowly like a thought forming in the dark. The world of data analysis began to fracture under the weight of its own disbelief. Physicists argued for crystalline mineralization. Chemists suggested a thin layer of ionized nickel forming spontaneous order under radiation pressure. Theorists wrote papers describing photonic self-organization in interstellar material, careful not to use the words that hovered behind every conversation, design and memory. But the pattern deepened. Each layer of light revealed finer symmetry. Every wavelength fit inside another like a series of nested harmonics. When the brightness was converted into sound, a practice used to detect hidden periodicities, it formed a tone so stable it resembled music. A single continuous note that neither faded nor changed pitch. Some called it a coincidence of orbital rhythm. Others recognized what it truly was: resonance. The object was echoing the sun. What that meant was not clear. Perhaps the surface had reorganized to absorb the solar field and re-emit it coherently. Perhaps the pulse was simply the natural result of materials pushed to their structural limits. But to those who studied it closely, it looked more like interaction, a dialogue between energy and matter, a call and answer written in light. At the edge of accepted science, the question began to shift from what is it made of to what is it becoming. For centuries, humanity had looked at comets as relics, frozen letters from the dawn of the solar system carrying the primitive ingredients of life. But Three-Eye Atlas had rewritten that metaphor. It was no letter, no fossil. It was motion learning to reflect meaning. a fragment of the galaxy adapting to its environment in real time. The data coming from the solar orbiter confirmed it. Each rotation showed minor adjustments to the reflective grid, tiny measured shifts as if the surface were tuning itself to maintain coherence despite distance and decay. These were not random. They followed a sequence 1 degree per 12 hours, perfectly synchronized with the drop in solar flux. To the untrained eye, it was only brightness fluctuating. But to those who watched closely, it was communication through alignment. Each shift said something simple and perhaps eternal: I persist. No signal was sent. No transmission could be decoded. The message, if it existed, was purely visual, a language of survival. The mirror phase was not about speaking outward. It was about listening inward. The object had become its own sensor, its own witness, turning the violence of sunlight into order. The phenomenon spread beyond the object itself. Space surrounding it began to show subtle coherence. Dust particles caught in its wake aligned magnetically, forming faint trails like ripples following a ship. These traces glowed faintly green in ultraviolet imagery, a spectral fingerprint of excited nickel atoms, the same signature seen before perihelion, now patterned like a field around it. It was not propulsion, it was presence, the wake of something that had learned to arrange the space it moved through. In that stillness, humanity's relationship with the unknown shifted again. For centuries we have studied the heavens as witnesses. We measure, we catalogue, we describe. But Thriatulus refused to be described. It answered with elegance, not explanation. It did not send messages. It demonstrated coherence. It did not declare its origin. It displayed adaptation. It showed that in the economy of cosmic intelligence, silence can be structure. The mirrors continued to shift, each alignment more precise than the last. The brightness no longer changed by distance, but by angle, as though the object now understood its observers and adjusted its skin to hide or reveal. The reflection patterns from Earth-based telescopes grew faint, then disappeared entirely. From the solar orbiter, it still shone with impossible purity. To see it from one perspective was to see everything. To look from another was to see nothing at all. Some believed this was proof of advanced engineering, a surface capable of controlling phase and reflection, rendering itself invisible to certain vectors. Others thought it was nature perfecting a trick we could not yet understand. Either way, it was something new, the universe behaving as if it knew it was being watched. And perhaps that was the true heart of the mirror phase, not technology, not design, but reciprocity. A fragment of interstellar matter becoming aware of observation and folding itself into the act. Observation changed the observed, and the observed answered by becoming something that could no longer be fully observed. It is easy to call this paradox, harder to admit that it may be a kind of intelligence not born of thought but of structure. The light from 3i Atlas now moves outward in perfect symmetry, its brightness declining only by geometry, not decay. The mirrors it made of itself carry no message, no warning, only the quiet proof that reflection can be a form of endurance. When the last data arrives, when the final observation fades into the archive, the astronomers will close their monitors one by one. None will say the word alive. None will need to. The sun will keep shining. And somewhere beyond its reach, a small silent shape will continue turning smooth, as equilibrium precise as thought, carrying nothing but the memory of having survived light. The numbers arrived slowly like snow drifting across a long dark plain. At first no one spoke of them. They were just data points, faint, uncertain, too elegant to trust. But as the model stabilized, as the calculations repeated without failure, the pattern began to reveal its truth. Every trajectory, every interval, every pulse of reflected light. All of it converged toward probabilities so small that they defied language. The alignment of perihelion, the blackout across every solar observatory, the harmonic frequency locked to the rotation of the sun itself. Each event taken alone improbable, but together the odds collapsed into something indistinguishable from design. At the European Space Observatory, one scientist calculated the combined probability that all known anomalies were the result of chance less than 1 in 10 million. Her supervisor asked her to remove the conclusion from the abstract. "We are not here to interpret coincidence," he said. Yet when she left the room, she carried the numbers with her simple, heavy irrefutable. There is a point at which probability becomes philosophy, a point where mathematics reaches its limit and wonder takes over. In that narrow space between proof and faith, 3R, Atlas continued to move, silent, steady, untouched by the questions it created. The mirror phase had not ended. It had evolved. The reflected light now oscillated in ratios that mirrored the orbital periods of the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, each frequency folded into the next as though the object were composing a harmonic portrait of the system it had entered. When astronomers first noticed this, they dismissed it as correlation bias, but the timing matched too closely. The brightness peaks aligned with the positions of the planets relative to the Sun. A resonance built on geometry, not on motion. If coincidence can sing, this was its song. A researcher in Kyoto plotted the reflection frequencies on a logarithmic scale and found a pattern hidden within the ratio's asymmetry, resembling the hydrogen emission line at 1420 MHz, the frequency long considered the universal constant of communication. The connection was faint, symbolic perhaps, but undeniable in its beauty. The universe was not shouting, it was whispering through proportion. The discovery spread quietly through encrypted networks. Scientists unable to speak publicly wrote in metaphors instead. They called it the pattern of intent. Not evidence of intelligence, but the possibility of its echo. The cosmos, it seemed, was fluent in elegance long before humanity learned mathematics, and still the object persisted indifferent to its interpreters. The pulses remained clean, the alignment steady. It neither sought attention nor avoided it. It simply continued moving through the darkness with precision that mocked our notion of accident. The human mind was not built for this kind of uncertainty. It craves closure, classification, conclusion. But 3 Atlas offered only paradox, the same mixture of proof and absence that defines every mystery older than thought. In observatories across the world, disbelief turned to reverence. Researchers who had spent their lives dissecting anomalies began to write like poets, their scientific language softening into metaphor. They spoke of harmony instead of mechanism, rhythm instead of orbit, purpose instead of coincidence. Some resisted, of course. The language of order frightened them more than chaos ever could. For them, 3C Atlas was simply a comet performing extraordinary physics, an artifact of equations not yet solved. They were right, perhaps. But even in their explanations, a strange quiet lingered. The data had stopped obeying theory, and theory had stopped resisting awe. One night at a symposium broadcast privately between institutions, an astrophysicist from Chile summarized the collective unease in a single sentence. He said, "We have stopped studying it. It has begun studying us." The silence that followed was not disbelief. It was recognition. The idea was not that 3I Atlas possessed consciousness, but that its presence created reflection not only of light, but of perspective. In its calm, ordered defiance of probability, it made humanity see itself from the outside, a species obsessed with explanation, terrified of meaning, yet endlessly drawn to both. Each new piece of data deepened that mirror. The reflectivity curves began to fluctuate with an odd synchronicity to Earth's rotation. The timing matched the hours when our observatories were facing the sun, when our instruments were watching. That more than anything unsettled those who still held on to coincidence. It implied awareness, not attention in the human sense, but a feedback between observation and response. When we looked, it brightened. When we turned away, it dimmed. No algorithm could explain the rhythm. The behavior persisted across all observation sites, even automated ones. The object's luminosity followed not human eyes, but human measurement itself. It was as if the act of perceiving had become part of its design. Somewhere deep in the data archives, a small team began testing this quietly. They synchronized multiple telescopes across time zones, alternating observation periods with deliberate gaps. Each time the same result when no one measured the reflection stabilized at baseline. When the instruments turned toward it, the brightness shifted not randomly, but gently, as if acknowledging the attention. It was not communication. It was participation. At last, a theory emerged, one that had no equations, no constants, no validation, only humility. Perhaps what we call intelligence is not a trait confined to biology. Perhaps it is a property of systems that achieve sufficient coherence to notice change and then preserve it. By that definition, Three-Eye Atlas was not a message, not a machine, not a being. It was a phenomenon that noticed its own existence through the gaze of others. And what if that is what consciousness truly is? Reflection meeting reflection until awareness takes shape. The probabilities no longer mattered. Once the math crossed into meaning, humanity had already stepped beyond the comfort of numbers. The wonder had returned not as superstition, but as science stripped of pride. In every era there is an object that teaches the species to look again. Once it was fire, then it was the atom. Now perhaps it is a mirror made of motion and silence gliding between the orbits of the planets, writing equations in the language of coincidence. 3 Atlas did not ask to be understood, it only required to be seen. And in being seen, it reminded its observers that seeing is never neutral. The universe may not care for witnesses, but it allows them, as if awareness itself were part of the experiment. Somewhere between certainty and wonder, between mathematics and faith, the object continued to turn folding sunlight into order. The probabilities dissolved into reverence, and reverence became the only proof left. No conclusion was written, only this quiet realization that perhaps the greatest miracle is not that something impossible happened, but that we noticed. By the time the last signals reached Earth, the object was already drifting beyond the warmth of the inner system. Its path curved outward, a thin arc etched in numbers and silence. 3-Eye Atlas was leaving, or perhaps simply continuing its direction constant, its pulse receding, like a memory too precise to fade completely. There were no more flashes, no mirrored harmonics, no signs of correction, only a soft decline in brightness, steady and exact as if it wished to disappear, not suddenly but gracefully. Even the most sensitive instruments began to lose its rhythm. The once perfect 5. 3 Hertz pulse had slowed, stretched thin across the static until it became less sound than echo, a vibration remembered by machines that could no longer find the source. In every observatory there came a moment when the data flattened, and when it did, no one spoke. They just watched the screens fade into baseline noise, a line of perfect calm, the last trace of a body that had rearranged their understanding of silence. For years, astronomers had followed it through uncertainty, through reflection, through wonder. Now they were left with something harder to quantify, the stillness that follows knowledge when it runs out of shape. The long quiet ache of farewell. The trajectory showed it moving on a hyperbolic path toward the outer heliosphere, cutting through the region where the solar wind begins to bow before the density of interstellar space. Beyond that boundary, radiation from the sun becomes indistinct. Beyond that, everything returns to equilibrium. It was a place no human object had reached intact, but 3-Eye Atlas was not human. It had survived heat that turned dust into plasma radiation, that erased chemical identity. Whatever it was, stone alloy or something in between, it had proven its endurance. The last observation from the solar orbiter came on a clear morning. The instruments caught one final reflection, faint but geometrically perfect. A pulse of light stretched across 3 frames, then gone. Analysts debated whether it was a coincidence, an artifact of cosmic rays, but the timing betrayed intention. The reflection occurred exactly at the interval of its former cycle, as if acknowledging the end of its own observation. And then the data stream quieted. No alarms, no decline, just silence settling in calm and absolute. For days afterward, the monitoring stations continued to stare into the void where it had been. The readings returned nothing unusual. The sun unbothered the stars as steady as always. Yet the absence carried weight, as though the space it left behind was not empty but preserved, still resonant with the memory of motion. In quiet rooms, the scientist replayed its journey from the first irregular glint near the solar limb to the last synchronized pulse before departure. Every stage formed a pattern too elegant to be random: ignition, alignment to shielding silence return. No one dared call it communication anymore. The word felt too loud. Instead, they called it sequence and unfolding governed by something deeper than the intention. deeper than physics perhaps. The question remained, had it been leaving us all along, or had it completed something here? Some believed it had harvested energy, others that it had shed a shell, leaving behind the pure core of whatever it once was. But a few, the quietest of them all, proposed a simpler thought, that the event was not about purpose at all, but continuation, a fragment of an older pattern still resonating through time, indifferent to the small lives that paused to watch it. In that light, 3i Atlas became less a visitor, and more a reminder that even motion can hold memory, and that every journey carries its own idea of home. When the final telemetry was archived, a line of text appeared at the bottom of the report object, now beyond measurable influence of solar radiation pressure. It was a technical note, nothing poetic, yet it read like a farewell. Months passed, the sun rotated. Earth's orbit carried the planet into new alignments. But in the background, radiation of the solar wind, faint oscillations persisted the same rhythm that had defined the object's passage. Not a signal, not a call, just a residual harmony woven into plasma and light, like a fingerprint pressed into the breath of space. Scientists called it the Atlas residue. To them, it was nothing more than leftover data interference. To others, it felt like memory, a kind of echo the universe itself had chosen to keep. The most haunting detail came later when recalibrations of the Parker Solar Probe's sensors revealed a curious symmetry. The residual oscillations aligned perfectly with the object's last recorded trajectory, extending outward like a corridor or perhaps a trail. It was as if 3i Atlas had left a path behind not of dust but of pattern. Somewhere far beyond Neptune, the rhythm still drifts faint but unwavering. It cannot be decoded, cannot be claimed, cannot even be confirmed, but it exists repeating through solar plasma, defying the entropy that should have erased it. And maybe that is all. Endurance really means not immortality, but persistence of form within the noise. In the months that followed, astronomers found themselves studying absence the way they once studied presence. They mapped the voids left by its shielding field, measured the harmony embedded in its silence, and realized that even emptiness can have structure. What 3i Atlas had left was not evidence, but awareness. The understanding that the universe is not static, that observation itself can leave ripples, that some phenomena exist only to remind us that perception and participation are the same act. Perhaps the object was never meant to be found. Perhaps it simply crossed paths with a species curious enough to recognize precision in chaos. If so, that brief alignment between a fragment of interstellar matter and the gaze of Earth may be all that was required. A moment where wonder became measurement, and measurement became meaning. It is said that every orbit is a kind of memory, that nothing in motion is ever truly lost. Maybe the same is true for what passes through understanding, brief, brilliant and gone, yet leaving a pattern too intricate to vanish entirely. So when the last observatory shut down its tracking program, no one spoke of closure. Instead, they spoke of rhythm, how it had begun, how it had persisted, and how it continued now without them. Far beyond our reach, 3i Atlas moves outward silent as light forgotten. It may never return, or perhaps it will on another orbit so long that only the stars will remember. But for those who once watched it, for those who turned sleepless eyes to the sky and listened for its hum, its departure was not an ending. It was a continuation of something older than questions, older than language. The universe does not explain itself. It simply reveals, then withdraws. And somewhere beyond the heliopause, a small body of mirror and dust glides onward, carrying the rhythm of its passage, the faint enduring pulse of an idea too patient for time. Tonight that pulse is still there, woven into background noise, waiting for those who might listen again. It says nothing, proves nothing. It only exists as all beautiful things do, between distance and silence. And that perhaps is the closest thing the universe ever gives to an answer. Long after the object vanished beyond the outer planets, the silence it left behind continued to ripple through laboratories and late-night observatories. Not the kind of silence that follows loss, but the kind that demands contemplation, the soundless echo of a question that refuses to fade. For months, telescopes recalibrated, databases were revised, reports rewritten. Every agency issued conclusions that sounded like endings, but none of them were. because nothing truly ended. The rhythm persisted, faint, mathematical, and unresolved. The question that remained was not what 3 Atlas was, but why it had crossed this path and why now. The universe offers infinite randomness, yet this felt like convergence, a moment when probability folded neatly into symmetry, as though coincidence had remembered its own design. In the offices of the European Space Research Centre, a quiet consensus emerged. Perhaps it wasn't an arrival at all, but a return. The orbital math hinted at a cycle, a possible re-entry every 54 years. If true, it meant that this wasn't the first time the object had passed close to the Sun, and that the story humanity thought it was witnessing for the first time had in truth been rehearsed long before. That idea changed everything, because it meant the event wasn't communication, it was ritual. A recurring choreography written into the mechanics of motion itself. Theorists began to wonder if the solar encounter was a function of a renewal cycle, a way for the object or whatever force governed it to reset its own equilibrium. Perhaps it wasn't responding to us at all. Perhaps we were simply standing close enough this time to notice. Yet the timing haunted them. Every time 3I Atlas reached perihelion, the Sun's 11-year cycle approached a magnetic reversal, the quiet inversion of polarity that reshapes solar wind and cosmic field alike. The resonance was too perfect. Every passage coincided with that shift, as if the object were drawn not by gravity but by balance. If that was true, then it had been visiting since long before we had telescopes to record it, long before the first words for star or sky were spoken. It's difficult for the human mind to hold that scale, to imagine that what feels like a revelation might simply be the latest breath in a conversation between matter and energy that began before life itself. Still, the question deepened. If this was not coincidence, was it purpose? And if there was purpose, whose was it? No one dared write intelligence in the reports anymore. The word had become too human, too narrow. Instead, they wrote organisation response pattern. But even stripped of poetry, the implication was clear. Something in this universe, be it physics or field or something older, was capable of arranging itself in ways that resembled thought. The object was gone, but its residue remained measurable, the faint rhythmic distortions in the solar wind repeating like a breath beneath the static. The same 5.3 Hz pulse that had haunted the data since the beginning, still whispered through the plasma, weaker now but stubbornly coherent. To most, it meant nothing. To a few, it meant everything. Because if the pulse was real, if it continued after the source had vanished, it meant that space itself could remember. And that realization shook even the most pragmatic minds. What is memory if not the persistence of structure after motion ends? What is consciousness if not a pattern stable enough to recognize itself? By that measure, perhaps the vacuum between stars has always been aware, not in our sense, but in its own quiet equilibrium. 3I Atlas may have simply reminded us of it. In one late-night report, an astrophysicist from the Kyoto Institute wrote, "Maybe intelligence isn't something the universe creates. Maybe it's something the universe occasionally reveals, like light caught on a perfect angle." Her words circulated in silence, quoted in private meetings, but never printed in journals. They were too philosophical for the language of data, too calm for the rhetoric of discovery. Yet they lingered like an afterglow. The question was no longer what happened, but what it meant to have witnessed it. For centuries, science has built its house on certainty, on knowing what can be measured and dismissing what cannot. But 3I Atlas existed in that narrow corridor between the measurable and the meaningful, a space where knowledge and mystery no longer argued but coexisted. Some saw that as failure, others saw it as evolution. If the universe is a machine, then this was a glimpse of its inner rhythm the moment the gears turned just slowly enough for us to see the pattern. If the universe is a living thing, then this was its pulse. The object's departure didn't feel like loss. It felt like permission to stop demanding explanation and start accepting participation. We were not chosen, not contacted, not enlightened. We were reminded that consciousness is not the privilege of biology, that silence is not emptiness, that reflection, whether of light or thought, is itself an act of life. A few months after the final signal faded, a new generation of telescopes began scanning the region, beyond Neptune, searching for any residual reflection that might confirm a return. They found nothing, and yet in the magnetic noise of their sensors, faint harmonics still flickered, not enough to prove but enough to feel. It was as if the sky itself had learned the rhythm and refused to stop humming it. Even now, the Darty analysts listening to the solar wind at 3 a.m. report, hearing that same subtle beat buried beneath cosmic radiation, but always there, pulsing patiently as if to say, the story isn't over, the question is ongoing. Perhaps that is how all great discoveries end, not with answers, but with an invitation to listen more deeply. Because in truth, 3i Atlas was never about the object at all. It was about the mirror it held up to us, a reflection of how far curiosity can stretch before it becomes reverence. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. And so the question remains unmeasured, unclaimed, unfinished, drifting quietly with the same grace that carried the object itself. Somewhere out there, beyond the heliopause, a rhythm continues in the dark. Perhaps it's mechanical. Perhaps it's natural. Perhaps those words no longer mean different things. Whatever it is, it moves without hurry, turning sunlight into silence, distance into meaning. And here on a small world that once watched it pass, we wait not for its return, but for the moment we might understand that it never really left. Tonight the data streams are still, the cosmos is quiet, and in that quiet a single question hums through everything that has ever looked upward. If the universe can remember its own light, what does it remember of us? There comes a time when every signal fades, not because it is lost, but because it has completed the circle of its own meaning. 3i Atlas had long since crossed that horizon. Its light now travelled where no instrument could follow, scattered among particles of dust that drift between the stars. Yet the silence it left behind never truly stopped. It lingers not as absence, but as the still breath of the universe exhaling after thought. The astronomers still gather sometimes. They no longer speak of coordinates or trajectories, not of spectral lines or rotational drift. Those numbers belong to the past. What remains is quieter, the shared understanding that they once witnessed something precise enough to resemble purpose, and gentle enough to resemble peace. No data could confirm it. No equation could define it. But when they speak of that night, the night the telescopes went blind, their voices soften. They describe the experience not as discovery, but as participation, as though the cosmos had briefly allowed them to feel its own interior rhythm before withdrawing again into privacy. Perhaps that is what wonder really is, the recognition that something greater has paused for us, even if only for a fraction of a second. In the archives, the data from the final observation remains untouched, a smooth sequence of nothing, a measured line of calm. When analysed, it reveals no sound, no fluctuation, no trace. Yet those who have seen it call it the most beautiful dataset ever recorded. Because in that silence lies everything science cannot say, the fullness of what resists description. The universe does not shout, it endures. Beyond the orbit of Neptune, the last fragments of sunlight scatter across frozen gas and uncountable stones. Somewhere in that endless cold, a single object continues its slow outward drift. It is no longer glowing, no longer resonating, no longer marked by human attention. But if the laws of motion remain true, it is still moving not through darkness, but through the soft persistence of space itself. One day, perhaps centuries from now, another civilization may detect its faint reflection. They will call it a comet or a relic or something else entirely. They will measure its trajectory, trace its patterns, debate its nature. And in doing so, they will repeat what we have done, stare into the mirror of the unknown and find themselves reflected there. Because that is what all mysteries do. They return us to ourselves. The universe does not explain its language. It only offers translation through experience. Heat becomes light. Motion becomes gravity. Silence becomes rhythm. Every phenomenon, every anomaly, every question is a new form of listening. In that sense, 3i Atlas was not an intruder. It was a reminder that even in a universe measured by entropy and decay, there is room for structure that feels intentional. And maybe intention is not the opposite of randomness. Maybe it is the harmony hidden within it. There is a beauty in that thought that the cosmos might not separate meaning from mechanism, that a comet's turn, a field's pulse, A void stillness might all belong to the same, unfolding a quiet intelligence distributed through every atom of being. When the last data analysis was archived, one scientist added a single note at the end of the document. No equations, no commentary, just a sentence written as though addressed to the object itself. "We saw you. That's enough." It was not the statement of discovery, but of gratitude. Because to observe something that defies certainty is to be reminded of one's own smallness and of the privilege of wonder. Years passed. The sky remained the same, and yet not quite. Occasionally, solar wind detectors still register faint ripples symmetrical and familiar. Perhaps they are echoes. Perhaps they are memory. Or perhaps they are the natural hum of a universe that has always been singing, waiting only for something conscious to notice. Every so often a young researcher finds the archived data and listens to it like music. They stretch the waveforms into sound, translate radio frequencies into tones. What emerges is a deep pulsing rhythm, a steady 3 Hz vibration layered beneath static. It is not melody, not message, but it feels alive. Some nights that sound is played in the background of observatories as the next generation of comets crosses the screen. No one calls it a signal anymore. It is simply the heartbeat of a memory, a scientific lullaby reminding them that curiosity can be its own kind of devotion. If there is an answer to the mystery, it no longer matters. The act of questioning became the meaning itself. And so the story of 3i Atlas dissolves not in revelation but in peace. The object drifts outward, carrying the pattern of its creation, perhaps endless, perhaps forgotten, but always continuous. Its rhythm remains imprinted on the field, its silence folded into the hum of cosmic radiation. Somewhere between the stars, the echo of its passage becomes indistinguishable from the music of the universe. Here on Earth, the observatories dim their lights. The data terminals glow faintly in the dark, reflecting the faces of those who still look upward. They know now that the sky is not a place of answers, but of correspondence, a dialogue between what observes and what endures. The story ends where all stories about the cosmos must with acceptance. Acceptance that knowing is not possession. Acceptance that silence is not emptiness. Acceptance that wonder once felt never truly fades. Beyond the boundaries of gravity, 3 Atlas keeps moving. It is neither message nor machine, neither origin nor omen. It is motion, a perfect continuation of the only truth the universe ever tells, that everything which exists seeks equilibrium, and every silence carries memory. In the quiet of night, when the telescopes rest and the hum of the instruments becomes a whisper, the scientists close their eyes and let the rhythm of that truth settle. The pulse of the sun, the breath of radiation, the faint memory of an object that once reflected light back toward its source. And in that stillness between stars, a simple realization takes shape, that we were never outside this mystery, only within it reflecting and reflected particles of awareness suspended in the same cosmic field. It's all right to not understand. The universe remembers for us. For a while the world forgot. The object was gone, the instruments were reassigned, and the sky returned to its ordinary rhythm, meteors falling through winter air auroras fluttering at the poles, satellites tracing their predictable arcs. But beneath the surface of human noise, something quiet had changed. Those who had studied 3i Atlas found it impossible to return to ordinary discovery. After an encounter with silence so structured, every signal felt different. Even the sun, that constant radiant engine, began to seem less like a source and more like a question. In laboratories and observatories, scientists spoke less about measurement and more about meaning. They started calling what happened at perihelion the moment of coherence. It wasn't a technical phrase. It was an admission that for a brief window, nature had organized itself in a way that resembled awareness. No one used the word intelligence anymore. It felt too narrow, too human. Instead, they spoke of symmetry, with purpose, balance without accident. What unnerved them most was how calm it had been. There was no chaos in the data, no sign of struggle or destruction. Whatever 3i Atlas had done, it did without effort. It had faced the sun, the most violent force in our reach, and survived by becoming something else. The more they studied that transformation, the more it began to look like a mirror. Perhaps they said this was how all systems endure, not by resisting change, but by listening to it. The object hadn't fought the heat. It had learned the temperature of its own threshold, then evolved within it. And in that realization, many began to see a reflection of themselves. Because isn't that what science has always been, an act of endurance, through understanding a way for a fragile mind to hold itself steady within the fire of the unknown? No one could agree on what the object truly was, but every theory carried the same quiet thread that observation itself had been part of the event, that perhaps the act of watching had completed the equation. In some sense, Three-Eye Atlas had turned the mirror back toward us, not to reveal what we know, but to reveal how we seek. For months after its disappearance, the Atlas tone continued to appear faintly in background telemetry. Not constant, not measurable enough to claim as fact, but present. A soft vibration woven into the plasma wind, repeating at long intervals. Some called it interference, others called it persistence. To one astronomer in Chile who had spent her entire career studying solar harmonics, it felt like memory, not the machines, but the universe's. Perhaps, she wrote, energy doesn't forget where it has been. Perhaps it remembers, formed the way we remember dreams, imperfectly but with meaning. Her paper never passed review. It wasn't wrong. It was simply too poetic for a discipline that fears poetry. And yet that is what lingered, the poetry of precision, the haunting calm of an event that refused to be reduced to explanation. In time, a few physicists began to refer to the phenomenon as temporal coherence. They proposed that the rhythmic harmonics embedded in the solar wind weren't leftovers from the object at all, but a reaction, a subtle feedback within the sun's own field, resonating in sympathy with what had passed through it. If that were true, it meant the sun itself had changed, not in heat or fusion, but in rhythm. The idea was beautiful and unsettling that even a star could remember. The equations describing this resonance read more like prayer than math. Frequency ratios, phase alignments, elegant fractions that repeated across magnitudes, the same quiet order that defines hydrogen's spectral lines and the orbits of planets. Each pattern a whisper of symmetry, hidden inside chaos, as though the universe were made not of matter or energy, but of relationships. And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice it everywhere, in the spacing of galaxies, in the spin of electrons, in the tides of thought itself. Everything is rhythm. Everything is alignment seeking equilibrium. Maybe that was the secret of Three-Eye Atlas, not intelligence as we define it, but harmony. Not communication, but resonance. A kind of cosmic breathing in which existence itself becomes its own language. For months, researchers tried to simulate its behaviour. None succeeded. Every model collapsed into noise, and yet no one felt defeated. There was serenity in the failure, as if the object had taught them the one law that supersedes all others: not everything that endures must be explained. By the end of that year, a quiet movement began among scientists. They called it observational humility, a philosophy born not of religion or mysticism, but of data too elegant to ignore. Its core principle was simple: observation changes both observer and observed. When you point a lens toward the unknown, you're not looking at it. You are participating in it. And that participation, however brief, leaves a trace in the data, in the sky, in the mind. So when the object's rhythm finally disappeared completely, there was no despair, only gratitude. The observers had been allowed to listen to something far greater than comprehension, the hum of a universe aware of itself. In that awareness, many found peace, a peace born not from certainty but from recognition that every mystery once touched becomes part of the one who witnessed it. Three Atlas was never just a body of metal or ice. It was a conversation written in physics and silence, a message that no one was meant to read fully, only to feel. It did not ask for worship or fear, only attention, only presence. Now, as the data rests in archives and the sun continues its slow burning, those who remember the event often describe it not as a discovery, but as a meditation, a moment when the boundary between science and wonder dissolved into the same breath. Perhaps that is what it wanted to teach us, that the universe does not hide its truths. It reveals them in ways we're not yet quiet enough to hear, and so the light of Three-Eye Atlas remains not in the sky but in the calm it left behind. The calm that comes when you finally accept that to observe is also to belong. It's all right to not understand. The stars remember what we cannot. Sleep now. The question has found its silence, and the silence at last has found its home. The last pulse fades into quiet, yet somehow the silence feels alive. Out there beyond the warmth of the sun, Three Eyes Atlas drifts not gone, only distant. Its rhythm hums faintly in the solar wind, a whisper too soft for our machines but not for the night. You've followed it this far, observer through light, through data, through the breath between questions. Now all that remains is stillness. The kind that exists before discovery and after it too. Maybe the universe never intended for us to understand. Maybe it only wanted to remind us that to witness is enough, that even the smallest signal caught for an instant before fading becomes part of the story written between stars. So listen not for answers, but for the quiet that follows them. That is where the cosmos speaks most clearly, not in thunder, but in patience. Out there the object keeps moving, here we keep watching. Both acts are sacred in their own way. Thank you for drifting through this silence tonight. May the hum of the universe find you in your dreams. Rest well, traveller. The stars will keep their watch, and if this story found you tonight, you may stay for the next.